We need £200 billion of investment in generation, electricity networks and gas infrastructure. Of this, at least £110 billion is needed in the electricity sector by 2020 in order to meet UK climate change, renewables and energy security targets. Without this investment, the UK will miss its decarbonisation targets, it will increase insecurity in supply, and it will potentially push many thousands of households into even more fuel poverty each year. So, market reform is essential to attract new investment into the sector. We need to create a system that is sustainable for the long term, both environmentally and economically. Above all, we need to create a system in which there is certainty, something which has been chronically lacking in the past 18 months. The government's energy bill promises to reform the electricity market. It says to deliver, and I quote, secure, clean and affordable energy. And of course, its proposals are based on four main pillars. One, a carbon floor price. Two, contracts for difference to support low-carbon generation. Three, capacity mechanisms to ensure investment in backup power. And four, an emissions performance standard to prevent any new unabated coal-fired power plants. Now, the first problem that we have is when the bill comes out later today. I have to say it's the first time that I've ever got up to speak about a government bill with the certain knowledge that whatever I say can be proved wrong in an hour or so's time. But when it comes out later on today, it's going to be claiming to be about electricity market reform. That's what the Queen said in the Queen's speech, and that is the title of the draft bill. But it's misleading. The core of the electricity market, the wholesale market, will not be changed by the government's proposals. Really, I think DEC is fiddling with subsidies and structures around the market rather than reforming the market itself. And critically, the government's market reform will do nothing to improve liquidity in the electricity market. Liquidity, of course, is an essential feature of a well-functioning market, a large number of buyers and sellers willing to transact at any time. But the government doesn't seem willing to introduce real competition into the market. They don't want to break up the vertical integration of the wholesale and retail elements of the Big Six, perhaps for fear of losing some of the investment that they desperately need to replace that 25% of existing capacity that will go off stream by 2020. But investment decisions are going to need to be taken now if generation capacity is to be available in time to replace the 25% of existing generation that will go off stream. So let's look at, first of all, the investment risks, and then let's look at the four pillars that the government is setting out in the draft bill to try and address the reform. First, the investment risks. Really, there are four, or if you're the nuclear industry, five key risks in investment. You've got planning, and the government has tried to address planning risks with the new planning policy frameworks. You've got construction risk. You've got power price. You've got the operational risks. And of course, for new nuclear, you have the waste and decommissioning risk. And of course, the key problem with the generation that the government says it wants to incentivize is that it is a high upfront capital cost with no revenue return coming back for up to an 8-year period. So the construction risks loom paramount in investors' eyes. Now, the government has tried to address the risks really by using only one tool, and that is power price certainty, and that is the contract for difference. But you can see that if all you have is a certain degree of certainty about the power price, the revenue stream that you're going to get in due course, then you haven't addressed what is the key problem for investors, which is the upfront construction risks and the 8 years that they may have to go before they see that return on their investment. So there's a real hiatus in the market, and that is even if one trusted the contract for difference to give the sort of certainty on power price that the government thinks it will. So let's examine the 4 elements of the government's proposals. Carbon floor, CFD to support low carbon generation, capacity mechanisms, and an emissions performance standard. First of all, let's look at the carbon floor price. Now, the floor price will set a minimum price for emissions. It will apply only in the UK, and it will work by charging a top-up tax on emitters if the price of EU allowances falls below the price floor. The lower the price of EU allowances, the more top-up UK emitters will then have to pay. Last year's budget announced that the carbon floor price would be £16 per tonne of CO2 from April 2013, rising to £30 by 2020 in 2009 prices. Now, based on current prices, UK emitters covered by the EU ETS would be subject to a top-up of £10 per tonne of carbon dioxide. HMRC estimates that the level set for 2013 will be equivalent to an extra £4.94 per tonne of carbon dioxide on top of the forecast price of carbon under the EU ETS. The rationale behind the UK's unilateral approach here is to provide a more certain carbon price in the face of volatile prices that are happening in Europe. The Energy and Climate Change Select Committee recently concluded that the proposal could have, and I quote, a devastating impact on UK industry without real environmental benefit. The policy could also lead to intra-EU carbon leakage. The total amount of emissions allowed in the EU ETS is, of course, capped at a European level. So reducing emissions in any particular member state won't reduce emissions overall. Emitters in other countries would simply have more allowances available and would not need to reduce their own emissions by as much. So it's very unclear what this first pillar of the government's strategy is supposed to achieve, except to drive down the prospects of British industry. Now let's look at contracts for difference. And here we come to the heart of what the governments say their policy is all about. Now, in the current market, energy generation that is capital intensive with low running costs, such as wind, is exposed to the volatility of the wholesale market, where prices are set by the marginal cost of gas and coal generation. The government's proposed way of dealing with this is to introduce the feed-in tariff with a contract for difference for all low-carbon technologies. Fits with a contract for difference is, of course, a long-term contract with an agreed price for generation and payments to top up the difference between the average market price and the agreed price, the strike price. The FIT payment would be made in addition to the generator's revenues from selling electricity in the market, and generators would also be obliged to return money if electricity prices are higher than the strike price. It will replace existing support through the renewables obligation. Now, the Netherlands has used a similar system since 2008 to support its renewable technologies. Denmark has supported its offshore wind market in a similar way since 2005. But to be successful, a UK fit with CFD would need to take into account how low-carbon technologies are at different stages of development with different costs and financing challenges. The new contracts are likely to be highly complex, and it will be difficult for generators and their financial backers to judge the likely returns and build business plans. This will make it harder for new entrants into the market to gain finance. Again, you come back to the problem of investors. With the bond markets, the debt market, they are not interested in a whole series of different strike prices for different technologies. It's too complex, they won't engage. So you've got a real problem with the markets putting the investment in if the only way that they see the resources coming out, the funds coming back, is through contracts for difference. They don't trust the strike price. And you may have seen the other day when the minister was before the Energy Select Committee, there was a great reluctance to talk about who was going to be the counterparty. Who was actually going to sign these contracts? Well, National Grid. But National Grid aren't going to be held liable for delivering the resource. Who is going to be held liable? Well, is it the government? Well, the minister was keen to say it's the public because it's going to fall on the public's bills. But again, the public is not a good answer for investors. Investors need certainty. They need to know where those revenue streams are going to come from. And at the moment, there is clear confusion in the government about what is going on. So the proposals have been put forward as a way of encouraging new entrants, but in fact, they make it far more risky and more expensive. And consideration also needs to be given to the vagaries of the market. With wind, for example, the best prices for electricity will often be when the wind isn't blowing, because at these times the supply will be less and other energy sources will need to be found to meet that demand. The contracts could also provide a perverse incentive to generate at times when electricity is less needed, because of course the price will be low. So what the government is putting forward as being the heart of the electricity market reform is achieving the sort of uncertainty on power price that led Moody's on the 7th of April to say of EDF that if they proceeded with the 4 units of nuclear generation that they were proposing, they might see a downgrading of their credit rating because of the uncertainties surrounding the income from consumers. Let's go to capacity mechanisms. The UK currently has an energy-only market. That is, generators get paid only for what they generate. We don't currently have any form of capacity payment to ensure that there is enough capacity in the system to provide security of supply. The margin of excess capacity in the UK's electricity system will fall over the next decade. But an increased reliance on intermittent sources, such as wind, will require increased capacity. At the time of last year's electricity market reform white paper proposals, a capacity mechanism was still underdeveloped. DEC believed that as levels of low-carbon generation increase, the price signal alone may not be sufficient to incentivize adequate levels of the additional backup capacity that is required. So a key uncertainty about the government's proposals is whether the capacity mechanism is designed only to deal with peak demand scenarios or if it applies to capacity more generally. Now, capacity mechanism to deal with the increased use of intermittent renewable would not be the same as requirements to meet peak levels of demand. For example, plants that help meet peak demand are only required to run for a few hours a day. But periods of low wind, of course, could last for days. So there's again real uncertainty here, which the government has to clarify in the proposals it's bringing out later today about just what will constitute this capacity mechanism. Finally, we look at the emissions performance standard. The EPS would prevent the construction of new coal plants which emit more than 450 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Gas-fired plants, which have emission intensities of around 400 grams of CO2, would not be affected. It's not clear what additional benefits the EPS will bring. There's already a requirement in England and Wales that all new coal-fired power stations demonstrate CCS, that's carbon capture and storage, on at least 300 megawatts of total capacity as a condition of planning consent, with an expectation that they will fully install CCS by 2025. And new gas plant must already be CCS ready. The EPS could cause policy uncertainty yet again and undermine investment in low-carbon generation if the standard is not consistent with the UK's carbon reduction targets. So, where are we? We're running late. Sorry, I've been too long. We have 4 pillars, none of which is going to settle the investment community's concerns, the key one of which actually raises those concerns and undermines the creditworthiness of the organisations who might be relying upon it. We have nothing in the bill, in the proposed bill, that is going to address construction risks for upfront investment technologies such as nuclear and renewables. And what is it about? Well, it goes to my second lie of the morning, that we can have 16 gigawatts of nuclear capacity without public subsidy. We can't. It's that simple. But the government's policy is based on a lie, and politicians need to start standing up and say, energy is going to become more expensive. We need to reduce the amount that we're consuming by a dramatic national program of tackling consumption, reducing our energy demand, and then, and only then, might we stand a chance of getting the sort of reform in the electricity market that we need. Thank you very much.